Thank you very much. Over the years, it's been my pleasure to work for the OECD, with this OECD, very rarely, but sometimes against the OECD. And it's my pleasure now today to discuss this initiative. The interesting question for me is, that I'm going to come back to a few times, is this new and what is new about it? And also, why does GDP have such a durable hold on our collective discourse? Because Robert Fitzgerald Kennedy, 50 years ago, before I was born, had a speech as a presidential candidate in the US about the evils of GDP. And he was already in that speech, he talked about how GDP measures the prisons to which we send criminals, but doesn't measure the love in the family, and et cetera, et cetera. So more than 50 years ago, a major, probably would have become a president if he hadn't been assassinated, a major US politician had the same speech that Anthony gave us today, unfortunately without the OECD data, but I think with the same emotional, maybe even stronger eloquence. But not much has changed, probably in the public discourse since. I don't know when, but UNDP introduced several decades ago the Human Development Index, which on a much less sophisticated scale tries to do something similar with across the world. Simpler by necessity, because if you want to compare all the 200 countries, then of course you don't have this wealth of data, so they just stuck to wealth, education, and life expectancy, which I think, and I would argue, probably pretty well captures a lot of what also this initiative is aiming to capture. In more specific fields, we've had now in the EU now for 15 years nearly, a little bit less, the Lacan indicators, which try to capture the social well-being of a society in a set of fairly complex indicators. And, all of these things are successful in their own way. I mean, this notion that, we need to look beyond GDP is now such an established wisdom than the OECD is doing it. It's not Amnesty International, it's not Occupy Wall Street, it's the OECD, so I think you don't get much more mainstream than that. The Human Development Index, the Lake indicators, all these things are used in policy discourse. It's not like they're tossed aside, but they're just not the main thing. They're not, if you did a search of not just Financial Times, but I would guess also the New York Times, especially of the front page, I guess you would get many more hits of the GDP than you would get of HDI, which is the Human Development Index. So it's not that one is nothing and the other was everything, but the ratio is pretty imbalanced still, I would argue. So the question is, what is new and why is this happening? I will come back to what is new about this index, but let me just say in one sentence, I think we are seeing an initiative on unparalleled complexity in this regard. I don't think we have seen anything like this before, and it's thanks to the resources, intellectual resources and data resources of the OECD that we are seeing this, and I think that's very interesting. And I don't think actually there is other global organization which could do this at the same scale. Probably the World Bank could, if they decided to put the same amount of attention to it, probably no one else. So OECD is using its comparative advantage. But now the interesting question is, why hasn't anything like this replaced GDP before? And why I'm skeptical that anything like this will replace the GDP in the future or similar economic indicators. And I think it's because GDP actually does one thing pretty well, and that is that it captures economic performance of countries both in the short run and in the long run. Of course, we could make many arguments about that in terms of especially how it translates into well-being. China and its environmental performance being a prime example we could use about how GDP is really not everything. But still, it captures economic performance both over short-term and long-term. Let me start very briefly by short-term. Anthony mentioned the crisis. I don't know this for sure, and maybe, in politics, as in the courtroom, you should never ask a question that you don't know the answer to. But I would be willing to bet that if you do a timeline of these indicators over the last 10 years, you don't see massive changes. In countries' performance in individual areas and maybe in the overall. Because as Anthony mentioned in the presentation, these things are fairly static because they reflect certain long-term situations in every country. And so probably the 2008-2009 crisis probably didn't have the same impact on this index that it had on the GDP numbers. So if you want to know something about the short-term economic performance, this probably is not the picture that you are going to look at, because that's not its intention, let me say that. But I'm just why people find GDP useful. If you want to know, whether there is a recession, whether there is a crisis, how serious it is, then probably the GDP numbers are still the way to go. But that's technical thing. More interesting thing is the long-term thing. Why? Probably also looking at the relative performance of countries. Are we seeing GDP, adjusted for purchasing power parity, etc., but still being the dominant benchmark used for measuring, who is better off than who else? And I think it's because policymakers and ordinary people care about economic performance. And when they want to know what's the economic performance, also in the long run, they tend to look at the GDP because it's probably the best gauge we have of economic performance across countries. So I would venture to guess that most people know that GDP doesn't capture your quality of life, the same way most people know that there's more to life than money. But it's still pretty important to know how much you have in the bank. So I think if we want to talk about beyond GDP in the sense that GDP is going to disappear or become unimportant, I'm quite skeptical about that. And I think as a measure of economic performance in some variation, it's going to be with us for a very long time. And I think it's also going to be on the front page of New York Times or Financial Times much more than either this index or any other index. And that's because people care about economic performance. There is one of the most famous songs in Czech, which is not my native language, so I apologize for that, but one of the most famous songs in Czech is called, I'll translate shortly, Štěstí je krásná věc, ale prachy si za něj nekoupíš, which in English means happiness is a beautiful thing, but it won't buy you any money. And this song was recorded by artists shortly after the revolution, in which the Czechs...
Happiness won't buy you money?
Yeah.
It's like the reverse of the Beatles.
Exactly. And it's the irony, it's basically a riff on the Beatles from a society which was just emerging from communism into consumerism. And and it's a beautiful song about how sunset is a great thing, but Calvin Klein jeans is slightly better. And, and I love that song, of course, not because I necessarily agree with it, but I think it's a very nice... it's a very nice irony in the sense in which all of us in the more developed, consumerly satisfied world then tend to pretend that it's actually not that important because we all have it. So that's in the same thing I would a little bit think about. This is that, of course, once the economic performance is not the most important thing because you've gotten beyond a certain point, then you tend to look around for other things. So to finish, not to speak too long, I was really struck, and this I thought was very interesting and for me very inspiring. I'll have to think about it much more, by two things in the presentation. One was the result about the civic engagement. And I think I absolutely agree with what Anthony was saying in the presentation about this being a necessary condition of a good life, of a good society. But when people are asked about this, they don't, they put that in the last place from the 11, at least that's the way I understood that. And, economics, there's the concept of stated preference and revealed preference, and that's between what you show by your words and what you show by your actions. And, this is about stated preference. My first argument would be that if you went with the revealed preference of people, you might become more materialistic. But there is a second argument, which is that even there might be things which are not ends in themselves, but are the necessary means. And things like civic engagement are one of them. So the fact that they come out last actually doesn't tell us much for policy reasons. I mean, if it means that we should pour more into health and less into civic watchdogs, then I don't believe that, because without civic watchdogs we won't have health, or certainly we will have quite a wasteful and corrupt health policy. And the same thing goes for armies and prisons, the regretables, which is actually a very nice word. I've never heard that before, and whoever came up with it was really smart. But as we all know, in what's happening in the world, these might not be things that we would be asking for, but that doesn't make them any less important. So this leads me at the end as a question to me, which I'll have to spend some time thinking about, is what is this actually telling us? I mean, what is the message of all these data? I mean, beyond the specific comparisons, because specific comparisons are very instructive, on any specific policy, on any specific area. But overall, what is the message of this? And I'm not sure I have fully comprehended that, because I think the regretables might be regretables, but they are necessary regretables. Thank you very much.